Good evening, everyone. Great to be with you and to have those of you who are joining us online. As Lakshmi was saying last week, this has become a bit of a tradition, and we love it. We love St. Francis, and for many reasons, which you'll hear throughout, particularly Lakshmi's talks. You did hear last week, and when she speaks next week, we think of him at Christmas time. We, of course, think of him at other times. Our own teacher, Paramhansa Yogananda, called him a patron saint. So he obviously felt deeply attuned to Francis's energy, which is a joy then for us to be able to welcome that energy in and really celebrate his life and the way it continues to influence us. So we find ways to speak about him every year, and whether it's a full course, as this is for 3 weeks, or part of our Christmas program, we honor his presence in our lives. And we'll get to do that this evening in words, in music, in meditation. So it's wonderful to be together to do it with everyone. So we'll begin with a prayer, then we'll have a chant, and just a brief meditation, and you'll see throughout the evening we'll go from words to music, chanting some songs, and hopefully be able to feel his spirit here with us this evening. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Paramhansa Yogananda Ji, saints of all religions, friend and guide, Swami Kriyananda, St. Francis, we humbly bow before all of you. Great masters, be with us this evening. Help us to experience your joy in our own hearts. Help us to feel your love, your wisdom, your guidance of so many divine qualities. Simplicity, compassion, creativity, and so much more. Help us to become like you in these ways, following your example to perfect joy. Om, peace, amen. Has dived deep in thee today. Let's meditate together now for just a few minutes. One of the main qualities that Francis lived and brought into his time, which I'll speak about in just a few minutes, was the quality of humility. And this chant, particularly that line that says, "If I find not, I will not blame the sea. I'll find fault with my diving," meaning with great humility, I would dive again and again, knowing that the problem cannot be with the divine, but rather with my searching, with my diving. So let's just take a few minutes to meditate right now, holding that quality of humility in the most uplifted way before us as we spend just a few minutes in silence. Om Shanti. Amen. I was reading an introduction to one of the many books that I have that talk about the life of St. Francis, and it was written by a priest whose name I don't remember right now, but he said, "I've practiced introducing myself in so many different ways throughout my life. I tell people I'm Catholic. I tell them I'm a priest. I tell them I'm American." He said, "Nothing gets people to soften around me and to be interested in me as much as when I say I'm a Franciscan." He said, and it doesn't matter where in the world it is. It's interesting, to hear these words. What is that? Because when you think of even the avatars that we relate to or talk about, or so many other saints that we're always talking about, that's not necessarily the case at all. And yet, just like we were talking before class started tonight about that documentary called The Saint of 9/11, which is the story of the life of Father Michael Judge, a Franciscan priest who served in New York after a certain time in his life. And it was just such a beautiful soul. I've said it many times in my talks, but if you haven't seen the documentary, do. But it was that same quality in him. There's something about the Franciscan priests who just are living the teachings of St. Francis. You can't help but fall in love with them. And when you think about Francis, who was born, I think, in the very late 1100s or very early 1200s, but I think it was late 1100s, it was such a particular time in the world right then, because the whole concept of shipping and of trade and of discovering other countries, I mean, it's hard for us to imagine now, but it was brand new. So ships had not been sailing. I mean, it was not until 1492 that Columbus could even make his way here to us. So this is centuries before. And when that happened, excuse me, people were just enthralled with all of what they could obtain materially. Suddenly, these beautiful cloths, these beautiful dyes, these exotic foods, just everything started coming to people. And it came with a huge burst of materialism, not that materialism didn't exist in the world before, because it's certainly been there as long as mankind's been around, as has greed. But it really was an uptick in all of that. And here was this young man who was born into a family of great means and who loved life. He was really called a playboy of the early 1200s. He loved life, he loved to drink, he loved to be carousing through the streets drunk late at night. He loved women. I mean, he just was all for all of life on the material plane. Everybody always says he was a good man. He was a very good man. I think Lakshmi talked about this last week. But he was into it, and then slowly, and it's how it happened. It's not how we read about with the avatars. It's not how Jesus was born or Yogananda was born, or they come in and they're fully awake and realized. And they come, as we say all the time, they come back for us. But Francis really did not start life in that way, and there's never been any argument made that he's an avatar per se, or a fully realized being. But clearly he's a very great saint. And for most of us, we have so far to go to be able to be where he is that it hardly matters that last bit of difference. But mostly the point I'm making now is that he had to go through a lot to learn. He had to first learn to listen. He had to be aware, and he didn't always get it at first. God himself had to speak to him many times and say, Francis, you're missing the point. And we all know this story, which Lakshmi told last week. I'm not going to repeat her talk, but it's just a perfect example of what happened with Francis all of his life. When he heard, as he was sitting and praying at one point, Francis, rebuild my church, which came as the command for him to really bring people back to a true understanding of Christianity, in large part because of the times he was living in. What did Francis do? He didn't know what that meant. He went out and literally started carrying massive rocks and boulders, and I mean, there's so many stories, stealing his father's cloth and just so many things to try and literally build these little churches, which he did, and they're actually lovely. If you ever get a chance to get to Assisi, you'll see some of them. But that's not really what God was asking him to do. So there was a very sweet naivete about him. And I think when I think about what this priest was saying, and I think about how Francis is, he's like an ecumenical feature, an ecumenical teacher or presence in some ways. maybe like Buddha can be at certain times. Many people have a statue of Buddha in their home, and they're not Buddhists. Many people have Francis, particularly, of course, out in the garden, because he could relate so beautifully, well, to everything in creation, but to plants and animals, and that's how we see him depicted all the time. There's always a little animal or a bird or a rabbit, whatever it is, just resting near him, much closer than they would be to any of us, because he really saw the divine in every aspect of life, and he related to it in such a pure, energetically pure and clear way. There was not any difference for Francis between the birds or the flowers or the sun, the moon, the stars, than for any other human being. Every single thing was a manifestation of the divine. And as he awakened to that, and as he was falling in love with everything because he was falling in love with God, is really what it is, well, it just softens people's hearts. I was realizing even people who might not want to know a lot about God, they don't even want to use that word or hear the teachings, you show them somebody who can cuddle a little bunny rabbit, and that's it. They're all for it. Or somebody who sits to pray, and the birds just come to him. And then he says, now you have to be quiet. We're trying to pray here. And all of a sudden, the little birdies sit up, and they're quiet. And these stories were written, he lived at a time where things could be written down. So we know what we're hearing was true. A book that I've been reading every year for I don't know how long now, that was written by another saint, which adds a certain quality to it, a saint writing about a saint, Saint Bonaventure. And he was there. He lived with Francis. So these are firsthand accounts. When he says, I'll hold the book up. This is, it's called The Life of St. Francis of Assisi, St. Bonaventure. Yeah. I had one of the original copies of this, and I loaned it to somebody. So if you're watching and you have my original copy, it was so much prettier than this book. But anyway, the words are the same. No, actually, it's not true. That original, this is so beside the point, but in a way it's not, because it's a saint writing about a saint. But at the beginning of every chapter in that original copy of this book, St. Bonaventure writes a beautiful poem to Francis. And in that poem, he tells you everything he's going to describe about Francis. So it was particularly wonderful. This does not have that. So, again, if you have my book, feel free to return it any time. So we have all these accounts of who he was. And he went from literally people thinking he was blatantly psychotic. This is what would happen as he would be on the streets of Assisi, to one by one by one, people's hearts just being touched and opened. They couldn't resist as he deepened, as his really allowing God to enter and speak through him more and more often. Well, people were just magnetized to him, everybody. And I know, again, Lakshmi told some of the stories, but it could be the judge in a court, which in those days was a priest or part of the religious order, or people on the streets. Everybody but his father was won over, I think. His father was never quite won over. But just thinking about it, he was really an extraordinary being who, because of the times, because of the time that he was in, those of us who know about such things would look at that time of Kali Yuga, of everything being hard, concrete, black and white. What you see is what you get, no subtlety. And that's when he lived, the people around him had a hard time in understanding him. But the main point I wanted to make about that is that he had to live and teach in a way that was really going to get people's attention. He could not be subtle about his teachings. Nowadays, we can be more subtle. We're moving into an age where people, even if they don't want to talk about God, they're relating more from a place of energy. We're relating in more subtle ways than they did then, which is, of course, why Yogananda came now with the message that he came with, and to talk about energy primarily, and to be able to teach us about this very particular form of meditation called Kriya Yoga, because we are now awakening to the notion of energy. It's really all of what shifted in the early 1900s. Well, that was a long time after Francis was here. So the way he had to teach then, and we'll hear about it as I go through some of the qualities that he represented, which is what I'd actually really like to speak about tonight. What did he bring to us? What did he help awaken people to? From a perspective of consciousness, though he couldn't use the word consciousness. From a perspective of energy, though he couldn't talk about energy. So how was Francis going to be able to live these same exact teachings that Jesus talked about, that Yogananda talked about? And I'll show you that tonight. There's no difference. We had a class here some weeks ago, part of a saint's class, and I spoke that night about St. John of the Cross, who I knew nothing about St. John of the Cross. Born and raised Jewish, and most of the saints I don't know about. But Lakshmi just said his name to me. Why don't you talk about St. John? She said, sure. But it was incredible. Now, he, I think, lived in the 1400s, if I'm not mistaken. She's saying yes, which was still pretty much in the Dark Ages. But I found the same thing when I was really reading books about him. If you read with an open mind, or we would say in Jesus' words, for those who have ears to hear. So if you're listening with your heart, which is what those ears are, heart, mind, soul, and strength, you realize that, and it's not surprising, of course, that St. John was saying every single thing that Yogananda came to say to us. He was saying everything exactly the same that Jesus came 2,200 years ago. I mean, it's like that. Of course, it's not surprising to us. And the same thing is true of St. Francis. The messages are exactly the same. And when you start dissecting the words, you say, oh, he's talking to them about meditation. He's actually talking about seclusion. And he's saying, you can't begin to feel, he would talk about Christ, but you cannot begin to feel God's energy flowing through you if you can't get quiet, and if you can't sit quietly. And in fact, the man who wrote this book called The Lessons of St. Francis, whose name is John Michael Talbot, his name was very familiar to me. Then I realized he was a great musician, actually, a big guitarist. They recorded a lot. He sang with the group, actually, when I was younger. I thought, how do I know that name? But anyway, he left the world of that music and became a Franciscan priest himself and started a whole Franciscan community. But he said, I can't even imagine making my music if I didn't start by meditating for 3 or 4 hours a day. He calls it being silent in prayer, is what he says. But whatever we call it, those of us who know, we can call it being prayerful, but we're alone and we're quiet, or we can call it meditating. It's not that there's never any difference, but for our purposes right now, it's the same. And he's saying 3 or 4 hours, or I could never begin my day. And he's taking that from all of the teachings of St. Francis. So whatever words they had to use, however they had to communicate with the people of their time, because Francis was very severe in the way he taught. I mean, extremely severe. So we all know, I mean, he would not buy food. He often wouldn't accept food. He had one tunic and one robe all of his life. Imagine that. One, not like just the same exact outfit that he changed every week. No, he had one. He lived where it snowed, where it got very hot. One pair of sandals. Granted, his whole life was only 40-some years, but still, pretty long time to go with it. He was extreme. Whenever he felt that he had misbehaved, he would literally beat himself. He would insist that his brothers in the order would publicly demean him. You know, it just sounds crazy to us. Why would anybody need to do that? But he did need to do it for those times. The language is different, but if you let go of the language, even how Francis spoke about it, sometimes hard to absorb, but you ask yourself, what do we know about humility? What do we know about simplicity? What do we know about solitude? Because these are the words that are ascribed to him by everybody who writes about him. These are the qualities that people would talk about, but they're exactly the qualities that we're talking about on our path and that Christians talk about. And if you listen hard enough and you find the right Jewish people, that Jewish people talk about, because truth is one and eternal. And truth is truth. It never changes. It can't change. Doesn't matter who's describing it, what words they're using, what advice they're giving. We actually don't have to walk around in just a bare tunic with a rope around our waist now. But the truth is that if we really want to dive deep and have an experience of the divine, we cannot do that as fully or as deeply if we are sidetracked by all of the things we own, all of the business that we need to take care of. It just, it can't happen in the same way. I have some very dear friends who decided to retire from very lucrative positions when they were in their 50s. And they were retiring so that they could travel and relax, and they felt dive deeper spiritually. And they got, after they retired, they were already extremely wealthy because they got in during the early days of the dot-com companies here. And just, you know, some of those 20 or 30-somethings who overnight were worth many, many, many millions of dollars. But soon after they retired, they got into some investments with Bitcoin. And these are the earlier days of Bitcoin, not like last week, where I'm surprised people weren't jumping out of buildings, but before the crash of Bitcoin. And then they realized that from early morning till late at night, all they could do, because of the nature of that Bitcoin, was sit in front of their computer and manage their money. And for years, that's what they did. For years. I mean, it's an extreme example, but last night, what was the quality of the talk last night? Cynicism, yeah. Last night we did a class with Portland, our community in Portland, based on that secrets class that we did here a couple of years ago now. And the quality, the secret was how to neutralize cynicism. And what Swami Kriyananda talked about was greed and thinking that you need to have more than you already have, or that everybody should be treating you differently than how they're treating you. And he went on to explain, it was a very subtle message, but it was how out in the world can you be, but still seek that deep, deep love of God? Where is that line? So we're not going to walk around in the snow without shoes on our feet. That's not what we're going to do. But how many closets full of clothes do we have to have? How many cars? How much recording equipment? How many televisions? You know, I mean, I really mean it. And then think of everything that can go wrong with all of that. And then you're constantly keeping up with it. It's a very interesting quality that he was trying to relate, and he had to do it in the extreme way that he did it. But we're all, I know everybody in this room almost, but we're all looking at that same thing, but we're looking at it in 2022, and we're looking at it during an age of energy when things are lighter, and we're looking at it through the eyes of our teacher who explained these things. But the lesson is no different. So, let's see. I want to talk about some of these qualities, but I'm wondering if before I start there, maybe we can have some music. So I wonder we have a little impromptu choir. If you know the music and would like to sing, stand up and sing with them. Really. Father now. Jyoti, you can sing too? No. Not an impromptu kind of person.
No. Do you want to be on that mic, Marshall? Okay. Father, now that I wander with thee, flowers and fields are alive with thy joy. All that I owe to thee I've given. Now I sing in thy love, I am free. Father, now that I dance in thy name, birds and animals share in my song. All my sorrows, all my merriment join in music to set hearts aflame. Father, now that I wander with thee, birds and fields are alive with thy joy. All that I own to thee I've given. Now I sing in thy love, I am free. Father, now that I dance in thy name, birds and animals share in thy song. All my sorrows, all my merriment join in music to set hearts aflame. All my sorrows, all my merriment join in music to set hearts aflame.
That little piece of music is from, I don't know what it would be called, really. Swami Kriyananda wrote the story of St. Francis. Is there a name for that kind?
A suite, I think.
A suite? Anyway, there's a lot of music that he wrote from it, but you can hear the words are so much about St. Francis and just so simply lovely. So I thought to look at qualities that each person who writes about Francis mentions, and then just speak about each one a little bit, both about Francis, but certainly about how we live that, each of us live that, whether it's this particular path or whatever path people are on. Nobody would be here tonight if they weren't pursuing some of these spiritual qualities. So the first, of course, is simplicity. And there are several people who wrote about Francis. I mentioned Saint Bonaventure, but others who lived when he lived and who wrote about him, or theologians who came very soon thereafter, but who became Franciscan monks and nuns. So you'll see I'm actually reading some stuff from books because in their words, having been there, it's particularly lovely. This is a quote by Thomas of Celano. I don't know who that is, but he's quoted a lot in these books, so I'm sure he was a great theologian at least. But he said, because they had nothing, they feared in no way to lose anything. And that is just such a beautiful, again, this is about the quality of simplicity. So Francis was saying, if you have anything in the world, then you have to spend a lot of time being worried about losing it. That this is often at least what happens. I guess you don't have to, but most people do. But Francis was very clear that he did not want his brothers being concerned about that. So you remember he actually would not accept anybody if they weren't willing to give away every single thing that they owned, every penny of their money. They had to join the order with nothing. And many of them used to try and make what would sound like very good arguments, but if I come with money, then we could feed the poor, or we, a couple people would say we wouldn't have to beg, but of course Francis never saw it as begging, and he would not allow anybody to come if they wouldn't give away every single thing that they had. And they said Francis never felt that simplicity as he lived it was specific for the discipline for just monks. He said, and these are his words, it was a garden from which all other spiritual virtues grow. This is simplicity, a garden from which all other spiritual virtues grow, and as a prerequisite to our being both fully human and fully spiritual. And he talked about what happens when you take a tree and you prune it all the way back, and how for a moment you can feel the whole tree is gone, particularly if you've pruned it at a moment when it's full and rich. But then you see the next year that which can grow from having cut away that which was not needed. And he was absolutely adamant about it. And so many of the writers talk about this, and I think this is really important, that all throughout civilization, not just on any particular spiritual path, religious path, let me say that, but as one writer was saying, whether it was Henry David Thoreau and the way he spoke about really needing to get simple. He went away for 2 years, 2 months, 2 days, remember, to Walden Pond, to be able to discover that which he had been searching for and searching for. He had to simplify his life before he could do it. Anyway, they just mentioned all of these people, and so many great philosophers and writers who just say in one way or another, less is more. And I think, as we know, because Swami Kriyananda used to say it so often, once people have food and shelter, whatever that means to them, studies have literally been done that show that people don't get happier if they have more. And I think that's really true. You need to have the basics. You need to not be concerned. And they were doing that in Francis's own way and in its own time. But anyway, how much easier it is to find God if you can be simple. This is a quote of Jesus. He says, "I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of God." Now, we've all heard that in one way or another. But he was talking about the childlikeness, the simplicity. Again, each teacher in their own way, just relating to us how important simplicity was. I don't think that Francis used that word because he was so much more dramatic, but am I wrong? I'm just thinking now, wasn't it Yogananda who said, I forget what Francis called it, and we said we don't call it that, but we call it simplicity. What? Lady, that's right, poverty versus simplicity, exactly. So Yogananda himself is saying, we're not saying we need to be poor. That wasn't the point. We don't have to be poor, but we need to live simple lives. And I mean, it makes perfect sense, of course, but very wonderful to think it that way. Francis, the way that we can extrapolate from his teachings, I mean, along with all of what I'm saying, but just in terms of simplicity, is to often ask ourselves, what are needs in our lives? What are the needs that we have versus what are the wants that we have? And I think it comes down to helping us determine what do we need to have with us. So, having food is a need, having some form of sustenance. Going out for the lunch that many of us went out to today to celebrate, that was a want. We do not have to eat that way all the time. And we can think about it in terms of our homes, our clothing, the food we eat, everything, even about money, which is very hard for people. How much money do we really need to have? And I think we come up against this often because when we talk to people about tithing or donations, but really even tithing, very challenging for people, most people in the world, to think about giving away their money other than to their own families. Now, I'm aware I'm preaching to a choir here, but it doesn't matter. It's true for the vast majority of people. They may give to their children or help out their parents, but if you ask them to give beyond that, it's a foreign concept for most people in the world. So it's interesting in every aspect of our lives to say to ourselves, how could we simplify our lives? And I think most of the people I know in this community live fairly simple lives. But I'm amazed every year I have a practice of going through my little place in the community. It's not like it's a big house. And giving away that which I don't feel I need anymore. And every year it's bags full of stuff. How is that happens? There's 3 rooms in the house. There's not that much there, but those big garbage bags. So yeah, for many years I had the habit of if ever I bought a new piece of clothing, I had to give one away. If something came in, something had to go out. And it works. I mean, you don't accumulate as much stuff. And it does lead to a more simple way of living. Have I used this appliance in my kitchen in the last 2 years? If I haven't used it in the last 2 years, am I going to use it? Just asking myself that and ridding myself of everything extra that, even if it doesn't take attention in the sense of it could break down or it needs to be cleaned, or it takes energy. Accumulating things takes energy. It leads to more rajas, more unsettled, or what's the word I want? The energy's vibrating at a different frequency than when you walk into a room. There's less furniture, there are less things around. I'm going to embarrass her right now, but I went and helped Kamala Devi when she moved from her home in Menlo Park into the community. And I was there for one day, and she was just putting aside everything she was going to give away. And I kept saying, but wait, because it hadn't been my stuff. It was so beautiful. I did take one vase from her that now holds my kitchen utensils, but everything else I had to say, let it go, Shanti, or you'll be taking it to Goodwill next year. And it was true. I mean, she really did an extraordinary job of letting go of things that you had lived with for just years. Suddenly, they did not seem to have the same meaning. And it's actually a very healthy practice. That's how we would translate what Francis was doing. The next quality that has lasted through the ages when we think of St. Francis is solitude. He spent a lot of his life in solitude. If you've ever been to Italy and you followed in his footsteps and you go to some of the places, the one that really got me was Lermo, right? The caves that he and his brothers, when there were only a few of them, stayed in. In fact, that's the day we lost you too. We were at Lermo. But who remembers something like that? Anyway, it was amazing when you saw where they went and where they would stay for many, many months of the year. The simple way that they lived and how much solitude they have. Simple caves. And these were people who had nothing, so they were dependent on the outside world to some degree to be able to eat, and yet they would be far up in these mountains. And now we can drive there, but you couldn't drive there in those days. When I went to where he received the stigmata, Laverna, and I was thinking, he hiked up that mountain. It's a pretty big mountain. Again, it's easy when there's a road, but so that he could spend a big part of the last several years of his life, actually, up on that mountain after it was given to him. But he went up there anyway, and he went to the caves, really always finding a way to be in solitude. And it's interesting, every time Francis greeted people, the opening line of his greeting was always, every talk with God will give you peace. That's how he started his talks. Every talk with God. Now, he was talking about what he was saying to people, but he was also talking about spending time in solitude with God. I'm just going to read some of these things that I want to read. It takes me a moment to find them. Forgive me here. This is what this author was saying. This isn't about it. Said it wasn't that he was aloof from the world or unconcerned about its needs, because that wasn't it. And they said he established in his lifetime 24 hermitages, many houses of prayers. But he said everything that they built was always built far enough outside of the town that they could get to the town for their needs, but that the vast majority of their life was built in solitude. I think we would relate to this as seclusion, but in a way, even living in community. Because, for those of us who live in spiritual community, or maybe people feel this about even their individual homes. I know I feel about my home, which is in the community. It's a sacred space, and one could feel that way. But entering that community, really, it does give us the feeling of leaving the world, El Camino, Palo Alto, Mountain View, and entering into a place where the vibration is protected. The vibration is elevated because everybody who goes there wants to be living in a particular way. It's not that we always succeed, but it's always our goal. So if we forget personality and we forget a lot of the humanness that comes with all of us, when we walk in there, we feel that we're in a place where people meditate a lot. We feel that we're in a place of prayer. We know we're in a place where people basically eat good food of a high vibration. So it's not simply seclusion. It's not only seclusion, though Francis spent a lot of his life in seclusion, but solitude, that taking ourselves away from the world, was such an important aspect of his life. This man says about him, Francis and his godly friars would not have dedicated so much time and energy to finding and protecting silence if it were easy or came naturally. If anything, cultivating solitude has grown more complicated since Francis's time. And I think we all know that. The world's busier, it's louder, it imposes itself. But even then, Francis was saying, you have to put effort into this if you want to find that kind of silence and seclusion that will allow you to feel close to God. You have to. And I think we know that. That's why Yogananda himself said, and I've thought about this many times now in the recent years of my life, because it sounds so simple. But when he said, seclusion is the price of greatness, that's quite a phrase for us to carry with us. Why did he say that to us? Why did he tell us? And why did Swami Kriyananda repeat it to us so many times that we now, most of us know, we would take at least a week, sometimes 2, 3, 4 in a year, if we can, in seclusion, because it's the price of greatness, because only with this solitude that Francis was creating for his spiritual brothers, he knew that to be able to hear and feel God, that's what it took. So he did it in his way. He climbed this mountain year after year after year to go into a cave and stay there for a while. And I think we're doing that each in our own way. But I think what I'm trying to say, we're going to stop and have a little more music in a moment. Why am I doing this? I decided to do this because I wanted us to be able to appreciate that those qualities that would help us have an experience of the divine don't change. They never change. Doesn't matter if it was when Krishna was here, or when Christ was here, or when Buddha was here, or when Yogananda came, or with Francis, or with St. John of the Cross. When we read them, these things are not being written in these books the way I'm talking about it. I'm talking about it in our language to say truth really is one and eternal. Truth is truth. It doesn't change. We change. We try and come closer to it. We're drawn to it because we realize, when we live more simply, we actually feel lighter. We can have an experience of the teachings, not just read them or think about them. When we take time to be quiet or to be alone or to be in seclusion or just spend a quiet day in the house, or as you've all heard me say, sitting there alone, even working, listening to this Om chant going on, Swami Kriyananda chanting Om, and then to not hear anything else for 4 or 5 hours. That's renewing, that's deepening, that really does help us to get closer to God, even than coming to this temple in my office here and working, and we're all talking to each other, and we're doing great work. This is real seva, but it's noisier, it's busier. It's very different when we take that time to get quiet and go within. Francis was trying to tell people that, but every great spiritual teacher will tell us every quality that Francis came and lived right out loud in a town where nobody else was doing it. They were throwing putrid food at him. Can you imagine? I mean, I sort of have the same, not quite the same, I have to admit. Every time I think about the crucifixion, where you go to Jerusalem and you look at that cross and you say to yourself, wait a minute, they put him up there and they pounded nails through his arms. I mean, this is not such great karma that they were accruing when they did that to this perfect manifestation of God himself. Well, people were dumping putrid food out their windows on the head of Francis. You know, so even in those times, the message was exactly the same as it is now. He was saying, these are the things that you must do. We'll talk about a couple more of them. In whatever time we have left, we'll stop. We have more qualities than we'll have time for. But why don't we stop for a moment and sing a song? And we're going to sing Channels. It's Lord Most High. I'm sorry. I keep calling it Channels, which is confusing.
Lord Most High, our Heavenly Father, all our lives we dedicate to Thee. All our labors, all our joys and woes, all our pleasure, all our melody. Make us each a channel of Thy peace. When in darkness, guide us from above. Where there's sorrow, may we sow Thy joy. Where there's hatred, may we share Thy love. Lord Most High, our Heavenly Father, all our lives we dedicate to Thee. All our labors, all our joys and woes, all our pleasure, all our melody. Make us each a channel of Thy peace. When in darkness, guide us from above. Where there's sorrow, may we sow Thy joy. Where there's hatred, may we share Thy love.
Swami Kriyananda was so tuned into, well, he was just so in tune with God, really. But you hear these songs, it's hard to imagine they were written in this day and age because it feels so much like St. Francis. doesn't, he's just so tuned into his energy. I was reminding myself, Francis didn't sing that song. He didn't know that song, but it feels that way. I think we'll probably get through one or two more qualities tonight, and then we'll stop, because we have another beautiful piece of music that the choir sang this past week, which is so resonant with these teachings that I want to make sure we hear. But the next quality that I'd like to talk about is humility, maybe the one that Francis is most known for and was so extreme about it. I mean, I was talking, I can't remember if the class had already started, I think it had, but about the fact that he used to insist that some of his brothers demean him publicly. What is it? A car. Okay, good. Oh, great. That they would demean him publicly, and when they would, and it was very hard for them. You can imagine, this is your teacher. He's saying, tell me everything. Say I've done this wrong and that wrong. And, I mean, it sounds crazy to us, but it wasn't. And then he would have tears just flowing, tears of gratitude that he felt like all of the ways that he wasn't yet perfectly attuned to God himself were being exposed. And he would just love his brothers right out loud for doing that. And, you know, so many of these things, I had this experience when I was reading about St. John of the Cross, who wrote his poem, Dark Night of the Soul. I mean, we use that phrase all the time, but that came from St. John. And suddenly, I had such an understanding of why he felt that he had to suffer so deeply, St. John now, to know God. It came to me as I was reading those books about him, and I could feel it from his perspective and the joy that he experienced. And I felt that way each time I read about Francis, or so you read a little and you meditate, and you read and you meditate. Today I actually listened to a couple of different people singing Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. They put that poem, his writing, to music and listening to it. And, anyway, you can just feel where he was and how many people he's inspired, even though it was so dramatic and it was so crazy in a way. The way that he felt that he had to practice his humility. But here, this is something that St. Bonaventure wrote. First of all, everybody points out, what did he call his order? He called it something minor. He even used words that would say less, less, less. He was just so appalled by the notion of pride. But St. Bonaventure said Francis would have nothing to do with it. He's talking about pride. The saint had a horror of pride, which he said was the cause of all evil and of disobedience, which was its worst offspring. So he was relating pride and then disobedience. I mean, and we know so many of the vows that we take where we talk about cooperative obedience. Why do we talk about that? And that word obedience, which so many Westerners hate. But I think many of us feel what humility comes when we think about what it means to be cooperatively obedient, not mindlessly obedient, but cooperatively obedient, that it leaves us in a humble place. I was thinking today when I was reading this of Adam and Eve. I mean, right from the beginning, Adam and Eve decided, I know how to do this better. If we do it our way, it'll go better. And they ate the darn apple, thinking that they knew, even though they had heard God say, I've made you in the purest form. You are pure spirit. Don't be tempted by these physical longings. It won't serve you. And look what they set into motion. here we are, all these years later, we're suffering because they ate that darn apple, because they thought they knew it better. I mean, this is really, in a way, what Francis was alluding to when he would practice and talk about humility. Anyway, let me just see if there's one more little thing here that we'll talk about with it. This is a quote from St. Augustine that I loved. If you should ask me what are the ways of God, I would tell you that the first is humility, the second is humility, and the third is still humility. Not that there are no other precepts to give, but if humility does not precede all that we do, our efforts are fruitless. And that is just so deep to me. I mean, it's St. Augustine, but it was the life that Francis lived. If we can't live in a way that allows us to know that not self-demeaning, it wasn't that, he would never let his brothers do that. He took great care of his brothers in all of these ways, but practicing humility in front of God so that we can hear what it is any one of us needs to hear to continue to grow spiritually. Without humility, you will not hear it. Your pride of voice, the way that we think about ourselves, the points that we need to make, the way that we need to appear in the world, it just drowns out all of these subtle teachings that God himself is always trying to share with us. And I was reading all of this about Francis, but when I read that quote from St. Augustine, I just said to myself, that's it. We are both sinful and spiritual, Francis said. We're both frail and dignified, and understanding this balance helps us remain humble and allows us to have healthy, he didn't use the word self-esteem, but it doesn't matter, I will, without slipping into egotism. So if we can say to ourselves that we're deeply spiritual, and he uses the word sinful, we wouldn't use that, but we would say we're not yet quite perfected in the eyes of God, or in the image of God. We're just not there. We all know that. We still have something to do here. We wouldn't be here. And a remembering of that, again, not berating or demeaning ourselves, but a remembering of it allows us to continue on our path, to stay strong. That's why I love this, healthy self-esteem without slipping into egotism. And it's a very fine balance. And I think that's what a lot of what humility is. This is not from Francis, but my eyes just looked down and found it, and I loved it. I find the doing of the will of God leaves me no time for disputing about his plans. And that's just very dear, and it's true. Okay, so this is a quote by Padre Pio, who many of us know and many of us love. He said, "Satan fears and trembles before humble souls." That is so profound that if we're walking with humility, then all of that negativity, downward pulling energy, everything that we would call satanic, that which takes us away from the light, whatever it is, can't get a hold on us if we're humble, if we're bringing ourselves onto our path with humility. I just love that he said that. Okay, then let's just talk about a little bit of creativity, and then we'll quit talking, have a little more music, and I'll just end with a meditation. I thought this was so beautiful, the way people speak about Francis as being such a remarkably creative soul, which he was. And even that poem that we all know so well, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, that he wrote, apparently, I didn't know this until today, but it was the first poem ever written in the English language, in Italian. Sorry, it's English now, but in Italian. All poetry that was written by saints or spiritual people was written in Latin until then. So he allowed himself to feel the creativity that is God. You know, that because knowing, and he used to say this, we are all, he didn't say it in this language, our language, beautiful manifestations of the divine. He created us, so we all have God's creativity within us. And you know, he painted, he was a beautiful artist. I mean, he made the first creche. Just imagine having that thought. Instead of trying to teach people about Jesus and how he came. And he didn't say a word to anybody. He just went into this little hut, literally, one night, and created this live scene. He did a live creche. It was the first creche. And that came to him. But it came through creativity of the divine. It didn't come by figuring something out. He wrote such beautiful poetry. I mean, he created so many images that we still hold on to about animals and flowers. He wrote songs. Remember, he was singing on his deathbed, and people were angry at him. They told him it was basically unsophisticated and God wouldn't like it. And he was like, how can you stop me? I can't stop myself from singing, he said. You know, it was very interesting. People said that he couldn't possibly have really written Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon because he was blind. Did you tell that story last week? They say, whether this is true or not, I don't know, that because he was crying all the time, he was crying with joy and with the love of God, that he actually went blind in one eye. I don't know if you can cry so much that you would go blind. But in those days, they had some really, really demonic ways of trying to heal people. And, you know, bleeding people and other things, which is not so bad. But they would take hot coals and, what was that called? Just basically ablate whatever it is, a rash or whatever. So they decided that to heal his eye, they would take a red-hot poker and put it right on his eye. It's hard to even hear about it. However, he said, give me a moment. And he went deep into prayer with God. This is a true story, too. And then he said to the doctor, go ahead. And everybody, they said people literally passed out. They heard his flesh sizzle, but it was his eye, sticking a hot poker in his eye. And when they took it off, he was filled with joy. He said, I didn't feel anything. And he said to the doctor, the healer, whatever he was, if you need to do it again, please just do it again, whatever you feel you need to do. And then, why am I telling you that? Because he was blind in one eye. If he wasn't before that, he certainly would have been after that. But anyway, he was blind. And when people kept saying that he couldn't possibly have actually written the poem because he was blind, many of his brothers, and St. Bonaventure himself said at some point, don't you understand? He was seeing with the light in the middle of his eye. Literally, they said that. That's the light that he didn't need human vision. He was seeing with divine sight, and he could do anything. But he was so magnificently creative, even in ways that he was being judged for. But he said, how can I stop this? This is who God is. And it's true. I thought, what an interesting way to think of it. God, the biggest act of creativity was creating us. So how could every one of us not be? We are creativity. That's how we were made manifest. And it's a very important thing to think about because many people affirm all the time, oh, I'm not creative. I'm not creative. I can't do that. And everybody's creative. We all have our ways, you know. I remember the first time, because when I was little, I was always so embarrassed whenever I would have to draw something. In hindsight, I look back at some of my drawings. They weren't bad, actually, but they looked horrible to me. And I remember the first time that I realized that I was a creative cook. And I said to myself, look at that. I mean, I remember it was like in my 30s. You are creative. It's just, you're just not drawing pictures or writing music. You're cooking or arranging flowers in those days. You know, I didn't think of creativity like that. But we're all creative because we were made by that very act. And that's something that Francis lived. So we can all tune into that and discover other aspects of ourselves. So we got halfway through. That wasn't bad. And let's go ahead now. What I would like to do is sing the Valley of Peace song. This is a beautiful song that you know the choir sang. And we all loved it, and it's usually sung in harmony, but tonight it will be sung just the melody. The reason that I asked them to sing this tonight, well, you'll hear the words. We probably all know the words by now. But when they say, if Jesus is walking with us, then we're walking through this valley of sorrow, which are these lives, of course, but we're doing it with such deep peace. I felt like Francis, who lived in very hard times and lived a very hard life, but was a perfect embodiment of peace and joy, always. So.
We shall walk through the valley of the shadow of death. We shall walk through the valley in peace. And if Jesus himself shall be our leader, we shall walk through the valley in peace. There will be no sorrowing there. There will be no sorrowing there. And if Jesus himself shall be our leader, we shall walk shall walk through the valley in peace.
You know, whatever little plans we made before the class, I think that's a beautiful way to end the evening, just with that extraordinary reminder of these great saints, these beautiful souls come to earth, and they just come to remind us of just this. If we walk with these truths, if we live these truths, if our goal is to be growing ever deeper in our spiritual knowing and closer to God, with more simplicity, with more humility, with more joy, then there will be no sorrowing, no matter what comes to us. And that's what this song is saying. If we're walking, it's saying with Jesus, but as Jesus himself said, Jesus was the symbol for truth, for light, for grace, for God himself. And if we walk with that, holding that, aspiring to that, in everything we do in our lives, how could we feel any sorrow? How could we feel anger? How could we be cynical? We can't. They are truly mutually exclusive. And that's the great gift of being able to even sit together and remind ourselves to think about these teachings, to think about everything Francis put into motion, that we could review it and ask ourselves, how can I live closer to that deep, deep, deep longing for God that Francis himself knew? That's why we're talking about him. He showed us how to do it. He did it in the 1200s, but he came and he showed it. You just change a few words. It's not poverty, it's simplicity. It's not suffering, it's humility. We could just go on and on. We just change a word and we feel our hearts opening and God's grace descending and filling us with joy. So, thank you all for being here. It was a lovely evening for me. Thank you.